I just want to give people a chance to come in. But this is the webinar for Canadian Society for the Study of Practical Ethics. So hopefully you are in the right place and we will get started shortly. All right, hi everyone. I'm gonna get started because I just have a little bit of, business stuff to take care of before we get into our speakers. But I expect that people may be joining us as I'm talking. So first of all, hello everyone and welcome to the Canadian Society for the Study of Practical Ethics webinar series. This is our final webinar in our series that was from the sort of 2020 conference that didn't happen. So that's exciting. We've gotten through them all now, and we're going to be doing another webinar series next year. My name is Melanie Banks, and I am the president of the CSSPE. I always get it wrong. So just a few things about us. The CSSPE was formed in 1987, and we are committed to the study of all major areas of practical ethics, as well as addressing ethical issues and concerns that arise in the humanities, social sciences, professions, and other areas of activity and learning. We're very proudly interdisciplinary and accept people from all different areas of both academia and outside of academia, and students and professors and everybody. Everybody should be talking about ethics, so we think the more the merrier. Up until 2020, we always had our conference in conjunction with the Congress at the Humanities, and then 2020 happened and we went online. And again, this is our final webinar left over from that series. Our plan moving forward is to do a webinar series for the 2021-2022 year, and there's already a call for abstracts and papers that is out for anybody who's interested in submitting to that webinar series. It's going to be every second month on a Sunday afternoon, and the abstracts or papers are due September 1st, if I have that right. So again, check out our website. Diane's put that in the chat box so that you can check that out. And we'll of course email everybody all the time to let you know when it's coming up so that you can come join us. Yeah, so that's all my business. So I do want to start with a land acknowledgement. Again, it's always a little bit strange doing this in an online format, but here's the one I like to do. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of the lands that we are on today. While we are on a virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the land, which we call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this nation home. I guess that is, in a way, assuming everybody's in Canada, which I know that's not necessarily true, but there are Indigenous people everywhere. And so in a way, I think this is a good acknowledgement anywhere you are in the world. So the format for today, as a note to both our speakers and our audience, although I'm sure our speakers already know, you'll have 40 minutes to present your paper, and then there'll be a 20-minute question and answer. We ask that they can put their questions right in the chat function, just making sure that you're sending it to everyone. We can also, because there aren't too many people in here today, so if you're comfortable, you can also do the raise hand button, and then ask your question by turning on your camera, which is maybe a bit nicer way to have an interactive conversation, but just do remember it's being recorded. So if you're comfortable with that, that's great. And if you're not, then maybe that just in the chat box is fine. And yeah, for the speakers, I'll be timing you. And I'm gonna just do that I have like little 5-minute left kind of, things that I will hold up because I don't want to interrupt you. And then there's a time's up when the time is out. And to a certain extent, it's up to you. If you talk into your question and answer period, you will have less time for questions and answers. And if you leave a bit of extra time, then we'll have extra time for that as well. Today we have two exciting speakers and we're going to get started. So our first speaker is Casey Abalos-Orendain, who is talking to us today about a critical account of Habermas's communicative action as applied to Filipina migrant claims. So a really interesting looking paper. I'm quite excited. So join me in welcoming our first speaker.
Thank you, Melanie. Thank you, everyone, for joining us and listening to us. Good afternoon, right? It's afternoon there. It's 1 a.m. here in Manila. So forgive me if I seem a little sleepy, but I hope I don't put myself to sleep because I find this question of migration and critical theory very interesting. As you know, in Canada as well, there are so many Filipino migrants, and this is why I concentrate my research on migration. And since I teach philosophy in the University of the Philippines, I use philosophical frameworks. And in this case, I talk about the limitations of Habermas's claims, but I use his students, Nancy Fraser and Sheila Benhabib, to help me. So basically, up to what extent can I use critical theory, specifically Habermas's critical theory, and then how do I apply it to migration? That's what I want to do. And how do we frame migrant claims within this discourse ethics that he gives us? But first of all, how are the rights of migrant domestic workers different from other claims? So what I will focus on this afternoon, is on Filipino domestic migrant workers. So I'm not referring to those who are, for example, scholars who study abroad, or I'm not referring to people who simply enter the US or Canada as for long-term migration, but precisely for work. So I hope you can see the slides. So I turn to Nancy Fraser's critical stance in the case of Habermas and gender, and I mount the question of migration within this framework. And then there's a second part to the paper wherein, in general, I delve deeper into the question of rights as moral claims and rights as legal entitlements. And if the gap between the two distinctions is simply a matter of recognition, and Sheila Benhabib will help me with this. But first, in Nancy Fraser's article, should be in the next. There you go. In Nancy Fraser's article entitled What's Critical About Critical Theory, she makes an insightful inquiry into Habermas's oversight, which is his minimal inclusion of the gender issue. So for Fraser, this is a serious deficiency in his work, because for her, a critical social theory should frame its research program and its conceptual framework with an eye to the aims and activities of those oppositional social movements with which it has a partisan, though not uncritical, identification. So based on this definition, Habermas cannot truly defend his aim of the theory of communicative action as the beginning of a social theory concerned to validate its own critical standards without acknowledging the gender problematic. Fraser begins her inquiry with an important distinction which Habermas makes, which is the difference between symbolic and material reproduction. Yes.
So sorry to interrupt. The audio's a little bit in and out for some reason.
Sorry.
No, nothing to be sorry about. Do you mind me just checking are you using the mic in your headphones?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Could you just say maybe the next line and I'll see how the quality is?
Hello.
Yeah, that didn't sound bad. Maybe, if you can, just try to speak maybe a little bit louder. It seems like it gets quiet all of a sudden. It might depend on how you move, if maybe the headphones move. There's
okay.
static. Yeah.
But now it's the volume is okay now.
Right now it sounds good to me. And I'm sorry to interrupt. I know it's a bit disorienting. I just
No, it's fine.
Okay.
It might be the fan as well.
Okay.
Like a fan? No.
No. I don't think so, because we probably hear it more consistently if it was the fan.
Okay.
Thank you.
I was wondering if it's the fan because it's really hot in the Philippines. So
I would imagine.
Anyway, so just to go back, Fraser begins her inquiry with an important distinction which Habermas makes. It is the difference between symbolic and material reproduction. And according to him, this distinction between the distinction between the two can be summarized as the dualism between cultural requirement and survival imperative. So in order for society to maintain its system, both the biological and the social, these are the two social activities that we have to sustain. Put simply, material reproduction is social labor. It maintains our biological survival, what Hannah Arendt would refer to as activities that pertain to labor as opposed to work and action. It relates to the material substratum. Every life world is in an exchange with its surroundings. This substratum has to be maintained by social labor drawing upon scarce resources. So its main purpose is that of functional integration with the environment. What is essential with regards to material reproduction is the aspect of purposive activity, whereas in symbolic reproduction, the aspect of social action most relevant to it is that of mutual understanding. Social integration, the reproduction of memberships or solidarities, is dependent upon cultural traditions and socialization processes. So that belong to the category of symbolic reproduction. So just a quick review before I talk about this. So though it serves obviously as a clear delineation of the interactions present in the life world essential to Habermas's project, Fraser observes that there are inherent problems with this dualism that he presents. First, it creates essential boundaries that fail to consider activities that do not strictly fall under the two categories he sets. And second, it inadvertently reestablishes ideological pedagogies, which critical social theory is supposed to be able to theoretically deconstruct, or at the very least challenge. So For example, seen from this perspective, childbearing activities and practices, or child rearing activities and practices, which in our society are performed without pay by women in the domestic sphere, count as symbolic reproduction activities, since in Habermas's view, they serve socialization and the function of symbolic reproduction. Fraser emphasizes that this work is women's unpaid child rearing work, but she argues that child rearing is not strictly a symbolic reproduction activity only. She argues that it can also equally and at the same time be classified under material reproduction, because it is not merely the construction of children's social identities, but also their biological survival, which is at stake. So she explains that it is not only the case that mothers teach their children how to speak or how to behave, and when they do that, they pass on the language, values, metaphors that are part and parcel of this multi-layered activity. So caregivers obviously also maintain the physical well-being of the child. So this physical responsibility translates to the child's interaction with the material domain, feeding, bathing, playing, and even protection from the harms that can be inflicted by the world. So I also wish to add that it is also the case that the child is now a part of the physical world. So there's that as well. So this caring and rearing is and will be even more so integral in the formation of the material world as well as the social sphere, thereby cementing the material reproductive element in these types of activities. So I shall go back to this point later on. So the second criticism, which pertains to the ideological potential of such a distinction, could be used, for example, to legitimate the institutional separation of child rearing from paid work. So this is a separation, of course, that many feminists, Fraser included, consider a mainstay of modern forms of women's subordination. And it is at this point that I try to expand Fraser's argument to include domestic workers' claims. So domestic helpers, these are, of course, mostly come from Southeast Asia, for example. Domestic helpers as extensions of the feminists' claim of being confined within the household seem to propagate the issue of female subordination. So the demand and supply of domestic workers only serve to perpetuate the feminist issue without truly addressing it at its core. So what do I mean by this? But later on, I'll explain that. But this leads to other concerns, which is linked to this aspect of the migrant question. The fact that human rights violations and other claims happen within the privacy of the household. So in addition, most domestic helpers who serve as nannies or maids are women. So it seems prudent to frame the question of this particular migrant problem using Fraser's gender-based analysis. So the case of domestic helpers is interesting in that their work is characterized within the enclosure of the private sphere, that is the household. But the mechanism that brought them to this household is a transnational system, actually, which include both private entities, such as employment agencies, as well as public institutions, such as government agencies, consulates and embassies, or trade agreements between the host and the home countries. So the fact that they are being paid is an acknowledgement that this is indeed a type of activity that is necessary both in the symbolic and material reproductive sense, thereby proving once again that the line between the two concepts are not as distinct. So the most important fact that needs to be underscored is that most migrant rights violations happen within the household. Of course, it happens because that's where they live. Of course, there are other classifications implications of migrant workers' rights violations happening. For example, factories that do not comply with safety measures for employees. But um, the ones that do happen in other work environments, aside from the privacy of the home, they do get reported eventually and easier, and it does get better media mileage as opposed to domestic helpers. So the cases that happen within the privacy of the home usually get reported only when the situation is at its worst, obviously. So these issues are indicative of the same problem that Fraser is referring to, only made worse by the complexities of their case. So on the one hand, domestic helpers are part of the household and the private sphere, but on the other hand, they are part of a network that supports the capitalist economic system, if you will. So it is important to add here that this domestic labor force, it makes it possible for the other half, women, mothers of the workforce, to not only contribute to the economy of the host country and thus help maintain the life world, it also ensures more time for participation in the political goings on of the public sphere. So thus this migrant system adds to the productivity, again in the two ways that Habermas uses them, on these levels. So it would be interesting to note too how these domestic laborers affect the so-called symbolic reproductions as well, given the fact that they are cross-cultural, transnational practices being carried over. So for example, even Prince Harry had a Filipina nanny. So you can imagine, how he is affected by such cultural exchanges, right? So this labor force is a prime example of what Fraser refers to as belonging in the dual aspect activity. This approach, which posits two distinct systems of human activity and correspondingly two distinct systems of oppression, capitalism, and then the private sphere dominance or issues. So this is misleading according to Fraser because these are not in fact two distinct systems, but rather two thoroughly interfused dimensions of a single social formation. So in order to understand that social formation, a critical theory requires a single set of categories and concepts which integrate internally both gender and political economy, perhaps also race. So what we can postulate from here is how domestic workers and perhaps certain aspects of the migrant system of labor introduces new ways of applying and expanding some of Habermas's important distinctions. So a critical social theory should be able to challenge its own methodologies and reflectively allow for the addition of previously overlooked members and social movements that are on the fringes of this world. And how do these analyses help us formulate a more constructive view of migrant claims then? So this is when I go to the second part of my paper, which is on the rights of migrant workers. This is reimagining or challenging Habermas again, but again with one of his students. This time it's Ben Habib. So what then could a discourse ethics or accomplish given these valid critical claims? So if we follow Sheila Ben Habib's trajectory, we begin to see the political possibilities because we focus not on the justifications for universalizability, for example, but explore instead the social political possibilities that can be realized with the procedures that Habermas laid out for discourse. So, but we add a few elements that will hopefully enhance this framework. So in her earlier works, Ben Habib was concerned with the problem of universalism and developed a critique of communicative rationality And later, she rethinks this project of universalism by the program of Discourse of Communicative Ethics, Discourse or Communicative Ethics, by moving it increasingly away from what she, along with many others, considered Habermas at times extreme rationalism in articulating his project. So she attributes this to his excessive emphasis on consensus. So again, the recurring theme here is to question how Habermas's discourse theory, which despite its many virtues, still manages to exclude voices from various members who are on the fringes. So I believe that the projects that Fraser and Ben have posited, while challenging the current understanding of critical theory, also appreciates the promises of what it can accomplish, given a few adjustments. So we discussed Ben Habib from two fronts, in her critique of the principle of universalization, and second is her Arendtian thrust in her discussion of rights. So according to her, the basic insight of communicative ethics are the fairness of moral norms and the integrity of moral values, which can only be established by a process of practical argumentation, which allows its participants full equality in initiating and continuing the debate and suggesting new subject matters for conversation. So I think she emphasizes the discursive practical elements of communicative action, the elements which embody its political nature. By putting discourse at the center, critical theory comes quite close to establishing that lacuna between theory and practice, and maybe we can better appreciate what Habermas is trying to say because we can apply it more. So, however, one of the virtues and criticisms against Habermas is his emphasis on consensus. So, in the case of domestic helpers, obviously, the context does not satisfy the conditions of an ideal speech situation and all these things. So, it doesn't really apply. So, in this system, I mean, if you are a domestic helper, you are success, at least in the Philippines. You are a success in the Philippines if, for example, you can send money home, and you're even luckier if you become a part of the family that employs you. You're not, if you are treated as an employee, that's the best case scenario, and you're not a personal slave or other worse iterations of that scenario. And there are so many cases in the Philippines, especially in the 1990s. For example, the case of Flor Contemplacion in Singapore, the case of Sarah Balabagan in Saudi. And these are the worst cases wherein for Flor Contemplacion, she came home in a body bag. And so in this system wherein the employees serve a role that are not just within the private realm, but also belong to the material public realm, it seems only right that the narratives of these individuals should also be heard, but they don't really have a voice because they belong to the private sphere. I mean, so Ben Habib, I think, offers a perspective that's really worth noting. So she suggests that she focuses on, her focus on discourse implies two key points that are essential to the project. So first, that the discursive subject is central to the discourse, thereby not leaving anyone behind, because the process acknowledges the individual as a key player in the discussion and is not just a mere statistic. More importantly, it emphasizes the importance of the discursive subject as a moral and political agent capable of articulating her concerns and also possibly able to contribute to the political process of the validation of norms. So this recognition of her otherness is not just a phenomenological plea, it has actual impact when viewed from the perspective of an actor whose presence in this context is a product of transnational and international treaties and obligations. So what I'm trying to say here is that since domestic helpers are um, their case is a little bit different compared to other migrant workers. Um, how we listen to them or how we hear their stories um, is part and parcel of the discussion. It should be part and parcel of the discussion. So the second implication of Ben Habib's view is that it leaves room for adjustments in the creation of norms that justify practices. So this is the Arendtian right to have rights. It's imperative if we attempt to practice the cosmopolitan theory of the idea to have the idea of the right to have rights. In centralizing discourse instead of the universalizability aspect, it accords activity as the as the critical criterion by which to judge existing institutional arrangements, insofar as these current arrangements suppress a generalizable interest. So, but one can use this criterion, and I'm quoting Ben Habib here, as a critical yardstick by which to uncover the underrepresentation, the exclusion, and silencing of certain kinds of interests. The assumption is that institutions can function as channels of illegitimate exclusion and silencing. End quote. So this exclusion is inexcusable when applied to the case of migrant workers in general. This is because the very nature of the business um, is uh, is rife with problems that are contained within the private sphere. Um, so the fact that violations still happen despite the public system that supposedly looks after them demands stricter application of norms and more transparent means of checks and balances. So just as a quick summary, I'm not sure if I have time to do it. Do I have time to do it? Okay. So of course, people are driven to move, and whether the desire to move should be validated in a cosmopolitan norm that pertain to the virtue of hospitality, for example, as Kant says, it's beyond the scope of this project. However, the existing practices of migrant workers demand an examination of the systems and norms that are put into place because migrant workers are essential components of this life world or this workforce, and they play both material and symbolic, and thus these distinctions are they're tricky because we feel as if we're looking after them if we look after the one component as opposed to the other. So the demand for the workforce is part of the system, hence the institutions that uphold the system and benefit from this setup should be held accountable. Again, this includes not just the host country, but also the home country where the migrants originally come from. So if Ben Habib is right in claiming that communicative ethics promotes a universalist and post-conventionalist perspective on all ethical relations, it has implications for familial life, no less than for the democratic legislatures. So then discourse ethics is a good place to start. But based on what has been discussed so far, the promises of discourse theory or critical theory becomes more applicable if narratives are, of course, taken into consideration, if it can be utilized as parameters for personal moral judgment and validation of norms. So the points given by Ben Habib all relate to how the core intuition behind more modern universalizability procedures is not that everybody could or would agree to the same set of principles, but that these principles have been adopted as a result of a procedure. So these points presented by Fraser, meanwhile, show how these narratives are not given due attention and importance because we fail to recognize the validity of activities that pertain to a significant aspect of our social and political life. So, because of the inherent paternalistic structure that we have, both on the private aspect and the public aspect, there are inherited issues which are seen from the perspective of the domestic labor situation, and this is we have to take into consideration that any domestic helpers basically they continue whatever feminist issues we have because they just cover for the work that women from developed countries are not able to do. Okay, and they just help them do it within the private sphere. So in my project, the discourse we refer to is the ongoing milieu of migrant narratives and consequent claims. So while there are significant strides being made on the transnational cosmopolitan level, which come in the form of conventions for the protection of migrant workers, seen from the point of view of gender and using the enclosure of the home to underscore these challenges that face the claims of domestic helpers' rights, we are able to at least post a question within the framework of critical social theory. The questions I ask are not new ones, but the framework that I use, that I challenge really to address these claims because of these incidents that continue in this globalizing migrant-facing world. They are not just outlying agents; they continue to remain relevant. And if critical social theory promises what it intends to do, or if it is true to its name, rather, then it will have to address these people that are caught in its fringes. So that's it. I hope we have more time for questions, and I look forward to them. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was such an interesting talk. So as mentioned before, you can put your questions in the chat box, or you can raise your hand using the hand icon, which I'm sure everyone's familiar with. Okay, yeah, I see some hands up, so people know how to do it, so that's great. So we can do that as well. And since we have lots of hands, I will not jump in front, as I sometimes do, to ask my question first. I have put a little bit more time on the clock because there was a little bit of time left at the end. So we should have lots of time for all of these questions. So the first hand that I see here is from Ray. So I don't know if you want to ask your question.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the talk. I'm new to Habermas, and I want to know more about the distinction between material and symbolic, because when there are two ways of creation of like work, but I think like for a Marxist perspective, achievement of work, it's a term that's a successive term, right? Because there's a kind of work that's alienating, and when you talk about domestic workers, I think that's typically the kind of mundane works that people would think are somewhat alienating. And I wonder whether that's, how is it that it relates to the point that you want to raise about the symbolic, because domestic work, you're not rearing your own children. And there's one point that you've talked about, and then you started talking about domestic workers, and I want to see what these two ways of even the ethics of engaging in these two kinds of works, what yeah, so I hope my question is clear.
Thank you for your question, Ray. So as far as, do I understand it correctly? You're asking me to, sorry, what's the question? Are you asking me to distinguish the two again, or?
It's just in terms of material and the symbolic, how much it relates to, because if you only contrast it with the material in a way that anything that's not material is symbolic, then it seems that there is it like that, or is there more to the distinction?
I think that if we will be Marxist about it, as far as I understand it, material reproduction would be closer to that type of work or labor, what you're referring to. But the other type, which is symbolic reproduction, it's when we transfer, or we pass on our traditions and our values to the next generations, right? And these two types of reproduction somehow helps continue the life cycle. And I think what I found interesting in Fraser's perspective is that they're not all. It's not always the case that we can distinguish between the two. There are many activities that are both symbolic and material, or it seems symbolic, but there actually is a material aspect to it. So, for example, in the case of domestic helpers, because they are the second moms, the hand that rocks the cradle rocks the world, right? So, since they take care of the children, they really do, and they are part of material reproduction. They are part of the labor force, and they're there as a laborer. But what they do, it's actually symbolic reproduction, because there are a lot of wealthy people and there are a lot, and I say this because most Filipino domestic helpers, they go to, for example, Hong Kong, Singapore, in Saudi Arabia, for example, in UAE, and there are a lot of children out there all over the world, scattered all over the world, who probably know a lot of Filipino songs, right? And that's symbolic reproduction there. So I found that interesting. So I don't know if I answered your question, Ray, but
it's tangentially, but it's slightly. It's not directly about the migrants claim. It's so my question could be put like this: are there work that's neither symbolic nor material? Because I would have in mind something like, well, I might be taking a certain stance towards some brokers on the financial market when they buy on margins, like it's almost like gambling or betting. Are this kind of work neither? That's what I'm trying to get at. So.
Okay. So that's a good question. I think that if we use Habermas's definition, he would call it a material reproduction because it's part of that. But I would agree with you that because that particular example, in the markets, for example, it's not real, right? Like there's no material thing that you're handling it. So I get where you're coming from now.
Yeah, financial instrument, it has some work, but yeah, so yes. At least I know where Habermas stands. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great. Sandra, your hand.
Thank you. I want to thank you, Casey, for your paper. It is, it's very, very good in analyzing, I think, a whole lot of issues of within critical theory. And I my first question is going to connect a little bit with what Ray was saying, because I wondered when I was listening to your discussion if I would understand more your concerns if I had a story. And the reason I'm bold enough to raise the question is that stories come up at the end of your paper and the value of stories. And the reason, because when you raise the question, should their right claims differ? I thought, no. Now, their legal claims in a country might differ, but surely not their human right claims, right? And so I thought, okay, why would it be suggested that their right claims as human rights would differ? And I think one of the reasons might be that we get caught up in conceptual frameworks that don't even consider the human rights. And I don't believe Habermas is particularly interested in going that route. So maybe you want to think a little bit about that. But my question actually is about the last part of your paper. I don't like, for one thing, dismissing the notion of consensus. I think when you bring, it does not indicate truth. Definitely not. I mean, we learned that from Socrates, right? The majority agreement doesn't, and scientists would agree, so majority does not really give you absolute truth. And I think a very good idea to stop looking for it, but it is a good idea to look at the stories. And I was looking very conscious of your pictures. And that last picture, is anyone going to look at that picture and say that man should not reach out his hand? If you disagree with that, then maybe we don't even want to talk to you, right? So perhaps instead of trying to figure out how to make Habermas happy, might it make some sense? And this actually might make him even happy. Could you look at the stories and see what principle or action could arise from that story that it would be very odd, at least in the 21st century, to disagree with? My own research is in the area of Aboriginal rights, and what used to be regarded as okay to do to Indigenous people, it really isn't now. So obviously there's progress, but the notion of human rights that existed way back then was not a problem for Indigenous people. The problem was they weren't seen as human. And I'm wondering if that idea of a disvaluing is important. And that goes back to, I don't think you should bracket perhaps race. I think that is really integral to answering your questions. I look forward to hearing your comments.
Thank you, Sandra. That's very helpful to me. You gave so many points that I can work on to continue my project. I really appreciate that. To be honest, the point my dissertation is actually on Ben Habib and cosmopolitan norms as applied to migrant workers. And I didn't discuss Habermas at all. But I started reading, so I read Ben Habib and Fraser first, and then for my dissertation, and then I was thinking, okay, I better read a bit more Habermas because he's their teacher, right? And that's when I decided to write this paper, because I felt that I understood where the criticism is coming from. So even though critical theory promises a lot, I felt that the putting in gender really showed where the problem lies. And so from there, I took that and then and then applied it to my research, which is migrant workers. But you're absolutely correct. In my previous works, I would concentrate more on narratives and tales. And in this particular paper, I had to put the narratives in the footnotes because, because I had to, because there were so many cases to give examples and give names really to these things that I'm discussing. So maybe when I write my paper, I can start with a story or a narrative, maybe that can help, right? So thank you for that. And I wasn't even sure, should I begin with Ben Habib or Fraser? Because Ben Habib talked about rights. And so it almost seems as if I'm writing two papers, but actually it's like I just wanted to criticize Habermas, but apply what he's saying to migrant workers. So that those are the things that are on my mind. So, but thank you, Sandra. So very helpful for your, very helpful your comments.
So I'm seeing that, Philip, you have written a question in the chat box. I don't know if you also want to speak to your question or not.
Okay, I'll speak to
Oh,
that.
please.
Thank you, Casey. I found that an interesting paper. Well done. I see migrant workers coming and going all over the place, reporting to work at unearthly hours in the morning and staying 12, 15 hours a day, and then going home, or sometimes living on the premises of their employers. What's the great interest? This is a multi-billion-dollar industry with millions of people doing it around the world, most of them, the vast majority, women. What's the great interest or stake that migrant workers have given the liabilities of their profession? Could you enlighten us on that?
Apart from money, you mean?
Yeah, the money's minimal. I don't even know minimum wage. You?
Yeah.
Is it the minimum wage? I'm not sure.
Thank you, Philip, for that. Um, I think that in the so normally in the Philippines, at least, it's mostly economic. Um, our economy um, will simply suffer if we don't have these uh, money coming from all our migrant workers, remittances from uh, family from everywhere. I, for example, in my family, I think 80% are in the U.S. and Canada. So we only have a few family members who are here in the Philippines, to be honest. And um, so we cannot really, apart from that, of course, there's the, and I didn't even discuss it here in my paper, there's the colonial relationship. Just going to the US, for example, is it's something that it's a goal, really, especially for people who maybe are not as educated, therefore they think of the US as uh, a way to for greener pastures, really, and that still continues even up to now. So there's that as well. Um, Other interests, well, more opportunities, really, employment opportunities, which pertains to money, of course, but just better opportunities. For example, for migrant workers, even I was surprised because prior to me doing the actual research, I thought, so I earn more compared to, for example, a Filipina entertainer in Japan. And of course, it's not, this was in the 90s, right? Up to we don't in Japan they've stopped hiring and Filipina entertainers, but I thought that they would earn so much more compared to me, a teacher, really, right? But I was surprised. But it's just that if they do the same work here, it really is so much less. So there's that. I'm not sure if that covers I feel like you're asking more questions. Asking more from me, but I don't know
Well,
if that at least partially
yeah,
answers the
I think
question.
what's coming to light is these people are looking for greener pastures, but whether they're finding them, do you know anything about the rate of success? Are any of these people going on to higher callings, or do they just kind of wallow here for years and years as domestic workers, or do they go back home at some point, or what?
Oh, that's an interesting point. I don't have the numbers here, but I did have the numbers, and the goal is always to stay. It's not just to look for temporary positions, but to stay and eventually get their family. And it doesn't matter where it is, because it would be better if it's an English-speaking country. And that's why Canada, US, the UK remain the top goals, but anywhere will do. Uh, so it really is to take their entire families. Uh,
I see.
yeah.
Yeah, okay.
And you're absolutely correct. I agree with you. Just to add to the feminist aspect of the paper, there are more women going out of the country as opposed to men. So most men who do get out of the country, they are usually contract workers who go to, for example, in the UAE and in that part of the world, and they are factory workers or contract workers. But most of the women, they are the ones who are either nurses, domestic helpers, or professionals. So there are more women who are professionals, from more Filipino women who are professionals going abroad compared to the men. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
I see Melanie has put a nice meaty question here in the chat box. Melanie, if you want to, you can ask it, or Casey, you can just read the question here and answer it.
I'm reading it, but if maybe Melanie wants to.
Sure. So the summary is that I absolutely agree with you regarding the problems posed by home care. I also have seen firsthand the benefits of home care, both for the people being taken care of and for the people doing the caretaking, as compared to communal institutions, which we've all seen lately in the pandemic. I mean, even though home care workers got less support than, for example, long-term care workers, they were in a lot of situations exposed to much less dangerous, much less horrifying conditions, inhumane conditions, than those who were forced to overwork in institutional settings. So I guess all I'm trying to do is to underline the urgency of your project, and maybe ask you, if you could detail for me a specific strategy for improving the identification and resolution of human rights issues in the domestic sphere. Like, is that your goal, or do you think that simply a move to a more industrial model of care would resolve the human rights issues better?
Thank you for that, Melanie. Of course, that's at the core of what we do, right? I wish I have an answer for you that even I would accept. But first of all, it's great that we are talking about this more. And this is why I'm in a privileged setting that I can talk about this. But For example, I would have to say that in an academic setting, I don't think Filipino migration is that talked about, especially in philosophy. So there are a lot of papers on, for example, economic studies on Filipino migrant workers in particular, but not so much on the social sciences, which I think it's very important because um, we we are the ones who discuss rights. It is not, the economists or who discuss rights. So this is why it's so important to me. But I hear you, and I think what we learned from the COVID situation, because and this is another paper that I'm working on with a few of my colleagues. It's on the human toll of how many nurses, for example, have we lost, because there are so many Filipino nurses scattered all over the world. So we don't know the numbers of how many Filipino nurses have passed or have are victims of the COVID situation. And we are also secondary victims because we don't have enough nurses here at home because we keep sending them to wherever. And
Yeah.
even up to now, this is an ongoing question because there are actually developing countries who promise to give us more vaccine in exchange for our nurses. So this is an ongoing problem, exactly. So if I can give you a specific issue, I think it's good that we're having discourses about this. But I believe that number one, I think there should also be like a local, for example, from in my end of the world. Of course, it's for us to take care or provide more jobs so that more people will stay. Brain drain and all that. These are problems connected to these issues. Of course, it's if we provide more jobs, then it would be better. But for example, our current administration, our current government, they ran on this platform that we would have more people coming home, our overseas Filipino workers coming home. But actually, when I looked at their plan of action, this is something that I wrote in another paper, but it's they didn't really they didn't really have a plan for them to stay here, but they actually have plans of putting them elsewhere. So asking for more jobs, for example, in China and Russia, as opposed to providing more jobs here at home. So that's just reappropriating the workforce, right? So I think that on a local level and then on a transnational level, of course, when we deal with the host countries, there should be uh, norms and laws in place that will hopefully protect our workers, whether they are domestic helpers or entertainers or nurses or whoever. Thank you for that, Melanie. I hope that helps. I'm sorry I don't have if I had an answer, I would tell you.
Thank you, Casey. I did want to say I was just so thrilled to see this topic because, like you say, it's not talked about enough, and this perspective is so important. So thank you.
Thank you.
Great. So thank you, Casey. I don't see any other hands, and we're through our Q&A time. So if you can all join me in thanking Casey for this fantastic talk.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Always a weird way to clap on Zoom, but it works. So yeah, thank you so much. That was really, really interesting.
Thank you.
All right. Okay. So we are going to move on to our second speaker. So I'm pleased to welcome Jordan Desmond, who's going to give us their talk on care worker migration and the responsibility for rectifying injustices. So Jordan, I don't see you on my screen, but I'm sure you are.
Hi.
Oh,
Can
there you
you
are.
hear us? Okay, great.
Yes.
Okay, I'm just gonna share my screen here.
So whenever you're ready, take it away.
Okay, can everybody see this? Wonderful. Okay, so thanks to everybody for coming out today, and thank you so much to the CSSPE for inviting me to deliver this paper. So yeah, it's on care worker migration and sort of developing a theoretical framework for assigning responsibility for these sorts of global injustices or the injustices that accompany care worker migration. So I'll go through the paper. I have a little slideshow just to cue me along and give you guys something to look at so you're not staring at my face this whole time. And so I'll just get started. Okay, so health workers are migrating at unprecedented rates from low-income countries with low supplies of health workers to higher-income destinations. Among those migrating are care workers, such as nurses and direct care workers. These workers are of vital importance to healthcare provision, given their status as, quote, the principal providers of basic health services. As such, global disparities and shortages in care workers are liable to significantly undermine public health efforts in the low-income countries from which they tend to migrate. Complicating matters is the fact that these patterns of migration are often accompanied by considerable injustices to both states and individuals that have been shaped by social, political, and economic structures in which these acts of migration are embedded. Efforts to identify which agents might be responsible for rectifying these structural injustices must therefore untangle a complex web of international interaction occurring between states, non-government organizations, and individuals. In Care Worker Migration and Transnational Justice, Lisa Eckenweiler presents a comprehensive account of the various injustices involved in mass care worker migration, traces their social, political, and economic causes, and sketches a brief but promising picture of how we might go about assigning rectificatory responsibility for them. In the following, I critically examine Eckenweiler's model and argue on behalf of an approach to attributing responsibility that focuses on opportunities for effective moral action. I'll begin in section 1 by providing a brief outline of the sorts of injustices Eckenweiler identifies as occurring as a result of care worker migration. In section 2, I examine and defend the guiding principles of Eckenweiler's account of transnational justice. In section 3, I'll argue that the more particular attributions Eckenweiler makes entail certain limitations in scope and motivational capacity that undermine the potential efficacy of the account. Finally, in section 4, I provide a rough outline of an opportunity-focused approach to attributing rectificatory responsibility and argue that it offers a more promising model while maintaining the key contributions of Eckenweiler's account. Okay, so what is at stake? Well, as Eckenweiler rightly notes, the structural injustices endemic to the care worker migration crisis are manifold. Existing global health disparities continue to be exacerbated due to the tendency for migrant care workers to emigrate away from low-income countries in the Global South. Many countries in the Global South are therefore facing significant shortages in direct care workers that impose considerable strain on the systems of public health provision. Additionally, migrant workers themselves face enormous challenges, including feelings of dislocation, lower-tier jobs with lower wages, insufficient health insurance, and in some cases, restrictions on their ability to travel freely and visit home. To make matters worse, undocumented workers, who are now coming to make up a greater and greater percentage of direct care workers in high-income countries, face the additional threat of deportation. Giving rise to many of these challenges is the fact that as immigrants, migrant workers tend to possess diminished bargaining power in their labor relations and are thereby vulnerable to exploitative practices by their employers without sufficient protection or advocacy. These injustices are further compounded by the fact that migrant care workers tend overwhelmingly to be women. Often, gender norms and cultural stereotypes work to undermine the autonomy of women in these positions. For instance, the perception of women from the Global South as, quote, caring, obedient, and meticulous workers, end quote, constrains the types of work they'll have access to in destination countries. In addition, women are often unlikely to have a say in how their remittances to home get spent. Thus, not only does the broader issue of global disparity in the level of health services exist, but mass care worker migration carries additional structural injustices to the autonomy and working conditions of workers themselves that are in desperate need of rectification. Given the complex web of interactions that have both produced and perpetuated these injustices, if we're to have any hope of attributing to certain agents the responsibility to engage in rectificatory action, we must begin by articulating a framework of transnational justice that is sensitive to their structural nature. So Eckenweiler argues that most convincing accounts of transnational justice will do two things. First, they ground our responsibilities in our connections to those who perpetuate and suffer from an injustice. Second, they conceptualize responsibility for rectifying a structural injustice as distinct from blame for past wrongdoing. In what remains of this section, I'll take up each of these principles and articulate why I believe them to be necessary components of a plausible account of attributing responsibility for structural injustice. So the first of these principles, actually I'm just going to take a drink of water quick. Okay. The first of these principles emphasizes the necessity of framing approaches to attributing responsibility in cases of structural injustice as relational or role-based. Non-relational transnational accounts of responsibility, such as common ones that tend to focus on humanity, or common humanity shared across borders, fail to recognize the importance of the structural and institutional nature of relationships at the global level, and thus lack the nuance necessary to adequately assess responsibility. An important implication of the structural approach is that rectificatory efforts can focus on the nature of one's connections to an injustice and the particular opportunities for moral action that they afford. Not all agents will possess the same opportunities for moral action. For instance, states to whom we have assigned responsibility will possess drastically different opportunities to rectify structural injustices from particular individuals residing in these states, because each is connected to the injustice in a different way, and these connections attach to distinct opportunities. Thus, we might attribute to a state the responsibility of subsidizing or financing the education of care workers in source countries, and attribute to individuals the responsibility of engaging in political institutions to demand legislation for just labor policies. If an account of global justice fails to pay adequate attention to the diversity of these connections, it will fail to grasp the particularity of our opportunities for moral action. Thus, Eckenweiler rightly concludes that any plausible approach to transnational justice must sufficiently recognize this reality. In light of this, assigning responsibility to rectify structural injustices will necessitate a constant reflection on these connections and how they relate to the structural injustices at hand. The second principle of Eckenweiler's account focuses on, quote, the necessity of conceptualizing moral and political responsibility as distinct for blame from past wrongdoings, end quote. This sentiment seems to trace a distinction drawn by Claudia Card, who argues that we must distinguish between forward-looking and backward-looking accounts of attributing moral responsibility. Backward-looking attributions of responsibility identify, quote, what has been done, and assess the extent to which we can be praised, blamed, punished, or rewarded for our contributory actions. While such attributions certainly account for a considerable amount of our day-to-day attributions of responsibility, Eckenweiler rightly notes that it may prove counterproductive to focus on attributing blame for structural injustice, given both the difficulty of doing so and the fact that it is not obvious how doing so will serve rectificatory efforts. A more fruitful approach might then be to focus on forward-looking attributions. Forward-looking attributions of responsibility typically point to positive obligations to respond to a certain state of affairs in some way. In the context of injustice, we might characterize forward-looking attributions of responsibility as attributing to some agent or set of agents an obligation to act in such a way so as to rectify the injustice or contribute to rectificatory efforts. In doing so, we sidestep the issue of tracing the complex causal contributions of various agents and actors, and instead focus on how we might best approach the question of rectification. Attributions of blame may no doubt prove important in other respects, but it's not clear an answer to this question is necessary in order to identify who might be charged with forward-looking responsibility. Thus, the questions of whom to attribute backward and forward-looking responsibility comprise conceptually distinct questions, and a promising account of attributing responsibility for structural injustices as Eckenweiler's does, recognize this. So there's no doubt promise in Eckenweiler's account. an account of attributing responsibility that lacked each of the principles identified above would be considerably impoverished in its efficacy in bringing about sufficiently satisfactory rectification. Nevertheless, there is reason to doubt that Eckenweiler's account offers an exhaustive picture of how we might go about attributing responsibility. In the next section, I'll take up the question of where this account may face limitations that undermine its promise. So, I'm going to assume sort of here that presumably a virtue of a theory of forward-looking responsibility is that it's effective in bringing out a desired state of affairs. So in matters of injustice, we should think a theory of forward-looking responsibility is better, all else equal, if it would effectively bring about circumstances of rectification. Two qualities of such a theory that will be of importance to its efficacy are the scope of agents identified as possessing responsibility and the motivational force attributions of responsibility are likely to have for such agents. In other words, the scope of agents identified ought to be sufficient to bring about comprehensive rectification, and the motivational force of attributions ought to be sufficient to compel the identified agents to act in the ways necessary to do so. With these criteria in mind, let's turn to Eckenweiler's account and the more particular attributions she makes, and assess the extent to which they're satisfied. So briefly, Eckenweiler identifies two sorts of agents to whom we might look in attributing rectificatory responsibility for the care worker migration crisis. First, Eckenweiler identifies those who benefit from the injustice, and second, those who, quote, participate in the structures that contribute to injustice, end quote. In order to test the efficacy of the account, we should assess how the attributions on the basis of these categories fare in terms of scope and motivational force, and we should do so when applied to a particular proposal for rectification. The idea here is that if Eckenweiler's account fails in these respects, then it'll likely lack the sort of efficacy we might desire from such an account. Thus, I'll assess the extent to which Eckenweiler's account can attribute responsibility in a way that is sufficient to instantiate a particular proposal from Joan Toronto for addressing the injustices done unto care workers. In Care as the Work of Citizens, Toronto offers a particularly promising method of rectifying the dislocation, exploitative working conditions, and loss of autonomy that migrant care workers are often forced to endure. Recall that many of these injustices can be traced to the status of care workers as immigrants, documented or undocumented. For instance, in certain countries, such as Canada, when care workers, quote, cease being useful as domestic servants, they are subject to immediate deportation, end quote. Thus, the fact that their capacity to continue to live in higher income country depends on their consistently being employed lessens their bargaining power in negotiations with employers and leaves them vulnerable to exploitative practices. Further, as immigrants, some workers are divorced from the autonomy that comes with the ability to participate in political institutions, and this may present a barrier to fostering a sense of belonging that is accompanied by a number of rights and protections that shield one from exploitative practices and give one an avenue for recourse against harm and injustice. Given that societies tend to, quote, conceive of citizens in terms of the contributions they make, end quote, and contemporary models of citizenship understand paid labor to be a constitutive factor, Toronto thus proposes that we ought to redefine citizenship so as to confer upon immigrant care workers the status of citizen by virtue of the invaluable contributions they make to the societies they're employed in. The issue that concerns us here is determining how we can provoke such a change in the understanding of citizenship through the assigning of responsibility. So while citizenship is in many respects a concrete political status, it is nevertheless a concept grounded in a shared conception among members of a given community. If there's no shift in attitudes towards citizenship in the members of a community, it is unlikely that changes in concrete legislation will ever occur. Thus, in order to carry out this sort of proposal, we require an account of responsibility that both attributes to citizens a duty to reflect on their attitudes towards citizenship and motivates them to carry out such a duty through political action. With this in mind, let's turn to Eckenweiler's account. In order to make an effective assessment, I'll focus on the broader of Eckenweiler's two attribution, the participatory attribution. The hope is that should the broader of the two attributions fail to effectively realize the proposed solution, then it should, a fortiori, cast doubt on the more constrained attribution. Nevertheless, such a conclusion is not of absolute necessity, given the fact that, as I'll later demonstrate, both of these attributions can be accommodated by the more expansive opportunity-focused approach. But let's move forward to Eckenweiler's participatory attribution. So Eckenweiler's reference to, quote, participation and the structures that contribute to injustice as a basis for responsibility seems to admit of a strict or a modest interpretation. Under the strict interpretation, we might say an agent participates in structures only insofar as there exists a strict causal relation between their actions and the instantiation or perpetuation of these structures. However, if we interpret Eckenweiler's position in a strict sense, not only will it be incredibly difficult to determine who has played a causal role in bringing about the injustices in question, it seems likely there will be a number of citizens who are excluded from any sort of forward-looking responsibility. We can conceive of citizens who neither participate in nor contribute to any of the injustices being done onto immigrant care workers, at least in the sense of discrete, recognizable causal contributions. And if responsibility is attributed, quote, only to this extent that this is the case, they will seemingly remain outside the scope of responsibility. This is problematic, particularly because, as noted, citizenship as a political construct relies on a shared conception of what it means to be a citizen. In order to alter this shared conception, the responsibility to modify one's definition of citizenship cannot fall only on a select few who have causally contributed to an injustice. The scope must be sufficiently inclusive so as to attribute this responsibility to the citizens of a community taken as a whole, or close to it. Otherwise, the change is unlikely to occur. Admittedly, Eckenweiler likely intends the notion of participation to be interpreted in a much looser sense. She writes that such a clause applies even if our participation or contribution is unintentional or mediated over time. In this way, the scope of responsible agents is likely to be much larger than it would be under the strict interpretation. However, expanding the scope of responsible agents in this way seems to come at the cost of the motivational force of the attributions of responsibility. Specifically, we're unlikely to be able to motivate individuals to take responsibility on the basis of contributions that are unrecognized, unintentional, or mediated over time. By widening our interpretation of participation, we sacrifice the motivational force that comes with pointing to clear-cut cases of contribution or participation and demanding rectification. Instead, we rely on agents to motivate themselves to discharge duties on the basis of participation they themselves are unlikely to recognize. The problem, then, is that no matter how we interpret Eckenweiler's broader suggestion for attributing responsibility, we seem to be left unable to carry out what would be a particularly effective way to respond to the structural injustices of care worker migration. Either the scope is far too limited to carry out rectificatory actions effectively, or the attributions will implicate agents in a way that fails to motivate them to carry out whatever duties accompany the attribution. In the next section, I propose an opportunity-focused expansion of Eckenweiler's account that's intended to address these concerns. So with the strengths and limitations of Eckenweiler's account in mind, this section will proceed in 3 steps. I'll begin by outlining how the opportunity framework can accommodate and explain both of the guiding principles upon which Eckenweiler's position is based, and which I argued constitute necessary conditions of a plausible account of transnational justice. I'll then demonstrate how the more particular attributions Eckenweiler makes can be accommodated by the opportunity framework. Finally, I'll argue that by approaching responsibility from the perspective of opportunity to make effective contributions, we can extend the scope of responsible agents in a way that generates more resources from which to respond to the injustices of the care worker migration crisis. To show this to be the case, I'll return to Toronto's proposal with the opportunity framework in mind. So to begin, I'll just briefly note what I have in mind when I speak of what I'm calling the opportunity account, though this will no doubt be fleshed out in greater detail as the section develops. The motivation for the account is the idea I noted earlier, that all things equal, we should desire an account of transnational justice that maximizes effective responses to injustice. The opportunity framework proceeds from the idea that not only does ought imply can, but can implies ought. That is to say that if one possesses an opportunity or a capacity to engage in effective moral action, that is to say action that meaningfully contributes to the rectification of an injustice, then one possesses a responsibility to do so. Opportunity to lend aid and the responsibility to do so thus go hand in hand, and it is this sort of relationship between agents that we should be concerned with in matters of transnational justice. With this in mind, let's see how this account can nevertheless incorporate the key insights gleaned from Eckenweiler's treatment of transnational justice. I'll begin with the latter and more obviously accommodated of Eckenweiler's two guiding principles. The idea that we ought to conceive of rectificatory responsibility as distinct from blame for past wrongdoing is, I argue, readily demonstrated by the opportunity approach. Under this approach, there is no principled reason for which blame should be tied to forward-looking responsibility. The question of who possesses opportunities to respond to an injustice is a distinct one, and must therefore be separated from the question of blame. The more interesting question is whether the opportunity framework can accommodate Eckenweiler's relational focus. Eckenweiler rightly notes that our attributions of responsibility ought to be sensitive to our connections to those who perpetuate and suffer from injustice. To put it more concretely, Eckenweiler seems to recognize that we can possess certain duties by virtue of our roles in relation to injustices. However, Eckenweiler's account does not adequately capture why we want agents to discharge their role-related duties. What is it about one's social connection to an injustice that renders it of the utmost importance that one take responsibility for discharging the duties associated with it? I believe this sort of sentiment to be best grounded from the perspective of opportunities for moral action. There is, I'm arguing, from the perspective of justice, no intrinsic value to compelling individuals to discharge their role-related duties. Rather, one's roles and relationships enter the equation due to the ways in which they mediate or create opportunities for effective action that would not otherwise exist. In this way, the aim of compelling agents to discharge their role-related duties ought to be an aim of forward-looking attributions of responsibility if and only if and because our relationships to certain injustices confer upon us unique opportunities for effective moral action, and compelling individuals to perform these uniquely effective moral actions will help us to most effectively respond to injustice. My argument, then, is not that Eckenweiler is misguided in demanding an approach to transnational justice that recognizes the importance of social connections and role-related duties. It is that we ought to explain the importance of these concepts by focusing on their capacity to bring about maximally effective responses to structural injustice, and by attending to the variety of opportunities they generate. Thus, each of the guiding principles of Eckenweiler's account seem to be well captured under the opportunity framework. But what are the criteria she suggests for attributing forward-looking responsibility in the context of care worker migration? Well, as I noted earlier, Eckenweiler's first suggestion is to hold those who benefit from structural injustices responsible for rectifying them, and I'm especially sympathetic to this suggestion in the case of care worker migration because the argument seems to closely track a sort of opportunity-focused reasoning. Beyond the fact that doing so accords with certain moral intuitions, Eckenweiler additionally notes that such agents will be able to, quote, adapt to changed circumstances without suffering serious deprivation, end quote. Because the costs of discharging rectificatory duties will, for such agents, be minimized, they're likely to be particularly effective assignees for such duties. That is to say that the mere benefiting from an injustice does not in principle demand attributing forward-looking responsibility, qua the bare fact that the agent has benefited. Rather, the fact that a given agent benefits from an injustice entails that such an agent possesses a unique opportunity to lend aid. This is because the benefiting agent is likely connected to the structural injustice in a way that allows them to respond without sustaining serious harm or deprivation. Given that certain agents have already benefited from the structural injustices of care worker migration, especially economically, they are thereby better suited than others to bear the costs of a moral response to the injustice, particularly if the response demands funding. What is important to note, however, is that high-income countries, for instance, possess this sort of responsibility only because the benefits of importing low-cost workers have made them particularly capable of responding with financial contributions. Thus, by situating Eckenweiler's account in an opportunity framework, we can still make sense of her suggestion that those who benefit possess special obligations to rectify injustice, but we can better explain why this is the case by appealing to the opportunity for effective response that this connection affords. The second suggestion made by Eckenweiler is that any agent who participates in the structures that contribute to injustice ought thereby to possess a responsibility to rectify it. Again, I believe the sentiment underlying Eckenweiler's claim here is highly plausible. Namely, the nature of our relationships and roles within international structures and institutions will be of the utmost importance in assessing how we ought to understand our responsibilities for rectifying injustice. However, it behooves us once again to consider why this might be the case. And once again, I suggest it is because of the way our relationships and roles, especially those that are participatory or contributory in nature, afford us unique opportunities for aid. This is to say that I believe that our relationships to others give rise to duties of care and concern that need not be grounded in any sort of causal contribution to an injustice or harm. It is simply by virtue of the opportunities for effective moral response that relationships to injustice may admit of forward-looking responsibility, and corresponding obligations thus arise. This is the ethos behind can implies ought. To be sure, it is no doubt the case that one's causal history will be relevant to determining one's opportunities for effective moral action, and so we need not discount Eckenweiler's suggestion entirely. Assigning responsibility on the basis of causal contributions can be an effective way of rectifying injustice because those who have perpetuated or contributed to injustice are likely to be in a privileged position with respect to knowledge of the injustice and the practices that perpetuate it. Having participated in these structures implies a certain position of privilege, and with this privilege comes the power to enact change for the better. To summarize then, the opportunity framework seems to be able to capture the force of both Eckenweiler's guiding principles as well as the particular attributions she thinks necessary for rectifying the injustices of the care worker migration crisis. In light of this, I want now to argue that where Eckenweiler's account fell short in scope and motivational force, the opportunity approach suffers no such limitations. Again, I should emphasize that the driving force behind the opportunity perspective is this. If one of the goals of forward-looking attributions of responsibility is to produce the most effective outcome in rectifying an injustice, it is entirely conceivable that there are relationships beyond benefit or participation or contribution that will give rise to opportunities for effective moral action. While Eckenweiler's account rightly identifies two particular sorts of relationships as responsibility generating, the opportunity-focused account extends the scope of legitimate attributions of responsibility to any and all parties for whom there exists the opportunity for effective moral response. In practice, then, adopting the proposed framework will look something like the following sketch. We begin by examining the roles played by varying agents in the injustice at hand. These roles may be defined by socio-political relations such as benefit or contribution, or simply by incidental circumstances such as geographic location or epistemic privilege. By examining these roles, we're given a strong starting point from which to assess the opportunities for moral response and the most effective ways to acknowledge and rectify the structural injustices of care worker migration. Nevertheless, while it might seem as though it would be maximally effective to hold all identifiable agents responsible, the nature of international aid is such that in certain cases, it will make sense to have only a limited number of agents participate directly. In these cases, given the goal of bringing about the most effective response, attributions of forward-looking responsibility ought to be made first and foremost on this basis. However, where there are additional agents to whom we can assign responsibility, we can assign them with the responsibility of funding the rectificatory efforts of other agents, or by supporting these others in other indirect ways. Presumably, by addressing each of these issues separately, we allow for more flexibility and a greater ability to effectively address structural injustice. Earlier, I assessed the strength of Eckenweiler's account on the basis of its ability to instantiate Toronto's proposal for the rectification of certain injustices. Now, with Eckenweiler's account situated within an opportunity-sensitive framework, I'd like to return to Toronto's proposal and demonstrate how this variation of the account can more effectively allow us to attribute the responsibility to carry it out. As Toronto notes, quote, Historically, definitions of citizenship change when there is a political movement by non-citizens that sufficiently threatens existing members into changing their definitions of citizenship." End quote. This is not, I think, the appropriate way to go about assigning responsibility for this change, as it effectively places the burden of rectifying certain injustices on the very victims of these injustices. Nor is it appropriate to confer this responsibility merely on those who benefit or contribute to the structural injustices done unto immigrant care workers. Of course, duties still fall on such individuals. However, in the previous section I argued that a change in the definition of citizenship will require a shift in the attitudes of the citizenship of the country taken as a whole. If there is no shift in attitudes among at least a strong majority, among contributors and non-contributors, participants and non-participants alike, there can be little hope that concrete legislation will be enacted to represent this shift. Under my account, then, one of the most significant connections that must be acknowledged is one's status as a citizen of a community wherein immigrant care workers are employed. And this connection is significant whether or not one's status as a citizen of this community confers any sort of benefit or has played any sort of contributory role in the injustices. What is important about this connection is that it affords one a unique opportunity for moral action, namely, to modify one's definition of citizenship to include the contributions of care workers and to encourage others to do so. In this way, we can begin to address attitudes regarding care work that undermine the respect these types of workers are afforded in certain societies. By increasing respect and recognize the contributions of care workers as significant, we can more readily incorporate such work into our conception of citizenship and allow these workers to be protected by state institutions devoted to preventing exploitation. This will not only address material issues such as disparities in wages, working conditions, and health insurance, but will additionally give migrant care workers greater autonomy and political equality, backed by concrete political institutions to express their interests in the societies they have migrated to work in. What is important to note is that one's status as a citizen offers a unique range of potential for moral action, just as would one's status as a beneficiary or a contributor. Each of these constitutes a separate social connection with distinct opportunities for moral response, and responsibility can be conferred to each of these categories discretely to the extent that this is the case. Scope is limited under this approach only by opportunity, not by any particular sorts of relations. Furthermore, by appealing to citizenship as a distinct type of connection with distinct opportunities that generate distinct responsibilities, we're more readily able to carry out this proposal than we were with the resources of Eckenweiler's approach. We are able to include all citizens in the scope of responsible agents by virtue of their citizenship, and we are able to motivate them to do so given the fact that it is their contributions as citizens to the shared conception of citizenship that gives them the opportunity to effectively respond to the structural injustice at hand. They are motivated not by having indirectly and unrecognizably participated in some structure of injustice, but by the fact that their concrete, recognizable political status as citizens generates a corresponding duty to reflect on the ways in which they conceive of citizenship, and how these conceptions can harm or benefit others. In this way, inclusive scope need not come at the cost of motivational force. Under the opportunity approach described, the scope and motivational force of such duties go hand in hand. So while there's much to be gained from considering Eckenweiler's suggestion for addressing the structural injustices of the care worker migration crisis, there's value to thinking about these suggestions from the perspective of opportunities to maximize effective rectification. Where one can make a contribution to rectificatory efforts, one thereby ought to, and the international community ought to assign responsibility on this basis. Where we are limited by the relative particularity of Eckenweiler's approach, adopting an opportunity-centric framework allows us to overcome these obstacles by turning the focus away from particular types of connections and focusing on the opportunities all types of connections possess. This was most readily seen by considering Toronto's proposal to redefine the concept of citizenship so as to include immigrant care workers under the protections it affords. However, I suspect the opportunity approach will find similar success elsewhere. Nevertheless, questions remain as to whether the motivational force of an opportunity approach would be sufficient, even if greater than Eckenweiler's account. Thus, future research might focus on how to more appropriately tie attribution of forward-looking responsibility to a motivation to discharge one's duties. And that's the talk, and there's the references, and thanks so much again, everybody.
Great, thank you, Jordan. Such an interesting talk, and I was like just about to hold up my 5-minute sign, so it was like perfect timing. Excellent. So same deal as before. You can either put something in the chat box or put your hand up using the hand icon, or you could put in the chat box that you have a question, because as you see, I usually call on you even if you write out your question. Of course, you don't have to go on camera if you don't want to, but I like to have that option available. All right. So I see Sandra's hand. I think that's a new hand. Maybe, Sandra, are you there? Excellent. You're muted. You're muted.
Oh, did you ask someone else or me?
What? Oh, do you have a question?
Yeah, my hand's up.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Jordan, I really, really enjoyed your paper, although I have to confess, you have made me feel like a dejected, pessimistic, stupid old woman who doesn't have the optimism of a young man. And the reason that I say that is because, okay, I wrote this down. Ought implies can implies ought, to which I then added, neither ought nor can imply I will choose. And one of the problems that I encounter in my research in the Aboriginal file is that politicians know what needs to be done. They can do it. They are not doing it consistently year after year after year. So these people are supposedly committed to a just Canada. They are supposedly committed to doing what the citizens want them to do, which means climate change would have probably been activated on a bit sooner. So I'm not sure that you can move from opportunity, knowledge of what needs to be done, and then talk about a commitment to justice that will get people to do what needs to be done. Could you help me with that? Because I don't want to be, and I'm not actually, I'm not a disillusioned old woman, but I would like to hear how you make that leap to real motivation that results in choices.
Thank you so much for your question. So I likely am being a little idealistic in this paper, and I note at the end that even if I think there's stronger motivation under my account, that's probably still not enough to get from opportunity to action. But I think maybe I can sort of posture at what I think might get us there. So so some of my work now is focused on the distinction between duties of justice and natural duties. So like what Rawls refers to as duties of justice and natural duties. And I'm really interested in what the sort of circumstances that give rise to duties of justice are. And I think my supervisor brought up Tom Cristiano's concept of the common world as what sort of facilitates social cooperation among those who live with one another, who work with one another, who see each other every day. And so I think, what I want to do is emphasize that migrant care workers who, may end up choosing to live in the countries they come from, who may, be working in destination countries only temporarily. Nevertheless, when they're members of that country, they are part of our common world. We interact with them every day. They contribute to our economy. They contribute to social reproduction. They allow the wheels to keep turning. They're sort of important pieces of our scheme of social cooperation. And so I'm not sure how we can foster the sort of civic duty that I think would realize this, but I think what I want to do is ask people to think about common worlds, think about what it means to see people crossing the street every day, to wave to them and say hi, to purchase a good from somebody who has purchased it from somebody else who made it somewhere in another part of the world. The idea of working together on this cooperative project, I think, at least in myself, has fostered a sense of duty to others that I hope is not sort of I hope it's not too much to ask of people to see that duty as attaching to the opportunities that are created by the common worlds that they're embedded in. But you're right that I'm sort of just asking people to act on these opportunities and shaking my fist at them when they don't. But I'm not sure if I have anything more concrete to make that attachment.
I'm going to encourage you to do what I encourage Casey to do, and she's already doing it. One of the things I noticed this week is people and even our politicians are responding to stories, real life stories about real people, especially if they're kids. So you might want to think about how philosophers who are doing the wonderful theoretical work that you and Casey are doing might not stay always in the abstract realm of the conceptual frameworks you usually create, but take them down into the real world. and there's so many real world examples out there for what you're talking about. So I would encourage that.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I'm really trying to push myself out of this ideal theory bubble that I've lived in for the last 4 years, and trying to, so it's nice to be participating in a practical ethics seminar, because I really need to get out of this this framework of ideal theory and start hitting the ground and doing some of the legwork that this sort of theorizing demands.
My dog's like walking around making noise, but so I was just going to interject my own question in here, and I don't even know if this is really a question, because I just kept thinking, am I getting thrown by this idea of like attributions of responsibility? And I just keep thinking, isn't this just distributive justice? Like, isn't that just like, we're just saying attributions are kind of like, it's not helpful. It's not helpful in like any real world problems. And it's just got to be like, you have all of the bread over here, so it's like time to share because we're all one. So I don't know if that, like, is that sort of, that's kind of what you're doing, or is it still, I guess the alternative, initially I was thinking what you were saying is that it's like you start from a place of who is responsible, and then you look at those agents and you say, out of those people in that pool, who is the greatest capacity to respond? So you're maintaining that causality or blame or something is still part of the conversation, versus just like who has the bread and they need to share it. So I don't know if you could talk about which one you're sort of leaning more towards.
Unhelpfully, I think I'm right down the middle. So I don't want to. I want to say blame is important, but it's important because blame sort of unintentionally accompanies the capacity. So typically, those who we can blame for these injustices turn out to be those who have the bread. And so I'm happy saying, look, most of the people that are to blame for these injustices are on the hook, and they have a lot of work to do in terms of rectification. With that being said, I also want to say that so you mentioned that why do we need to attribute responsibility if it's just a case of distributive injustice, and we say these people have not, and we can just sort of move from one to the other. And I think I'm partly sympathetic to that, but I also want to make room for injustices that occur to individuals that can't rightly be captured by the distributive justice framework. So, for instance, like Eckenweiler talks about like respect for care worker positions in sort of destination countries. And one way that we could increase the respect that care workers see in destination countries is, of course, to raise their income. That's typically in Western societies, respect for jobs tends to be tied to the amount of money that they make. But I think there's respect that isn't necessary. So I think we can respect care workers in ways that go over and above just paying them more. And I think it behooves like citizens of countries where migrant workers are working to look at the opportunities they have to do that. So they can. So say I employ a direct care worker to look after my grandmother or something like that. I can surely a sign of respect for the work that care worker does is to pay them above market wage. To say, look, I really value what you're doing for my family. It's an invaluable contribution. Here's more money as a result. But another way is just to look at those jobs as valuable sort of necessary components of sort of what I was saying earlier, the common world. So it's not just that they're economic contributors, but they're social contributors. They foster relationships between people who are in desperate circumstances with respect to health, and give them an opportunity to socialize every day, to form meaningful relationships. And so I think part of respect is acknowledging the roles that care workers play in facilitating those things, not necessarily economic. And so I think distributive justice is a large part of it, perhaps the largest part of it. But I still think just the framework of distributive justice doesn't capture all of what I want to put forward as an issue, I guess.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think also the idea that the injustice that you're looking at, or the injustices, is not like just like loss of money or like sort of like the obvious harms. Like the idea of like not adequate respect is not what I normally think of, and then that just kind of blows open the entire account to some like interesting areas.
Thank you so much.
I see a question here from you, Philip. I don't know if you want to turn on your.
Okay, here we go. Thank you, Jordan, for that presentation. It was nice talking to Casey's paper as well. I get a bit uneasy when I hear ethicists invoking the technological imperative. The technological imperative says that can implies ought, that something can be done, implies it ought to be done. To take a relevant example, if we can take, say, the COVID-19 virus and tweak it so it becomes more contagious and stronger, maybe we ought to do it. And so you did use that as a way of trying to develop your case for dealing with migrant workers. And it's a staple in ethics, of course, that ought implies can. That makes sense. Because if somebody ought to do something, that implies it's possible for them to do it. But the other way doesn't work, because lots of things are possible which ought not to be the case. So perhaps you could explain your invocation of the technological imperative.
So I have to confess that the can implies ought inclusion was a quippy slogan I just added to the paper a couple of days ago, but I'll defend it nonetheless. So what I'm not trying to say there, and I did try to qualify it a bit in the paper, but admittedly it sort of comes across vaguely in the paper, is not the idea that whatever can be done ought to be done, but that whatever. So I'm sort of reducing the category of things that can be done to good things that can be done. So whatever ought to be done might be a better way of saying it. But so the idea is that when I can act in ways that would improve the circumstances of others, that would reduce harm, when I can do what would sort of generally be recognized to be sort of morally praiseworthy or ought-worthy actions, then I ought to do those. So I'm trying to say that I have quite a demanding idea of what we're sort of responsible for in terms of like global crises, like the care worker migration crisis. And so that was sort of what I was trying to hint at with the can implies ought line.
Yeah,
So
but you're presupposing normativity in your definition of possibility.
yes, yeah, I'm
Maybe the ought implies can in disguise. That way. Thus construed, I don't have that much difficulty with it, but it's not the technological imperative in any case.
okay. Yes, and when I go back to the paper, I'll definitely adjust that. So it's clear that I'm sort of presupposing
Yeah.
some level of normativity. Yeah. Thanks so much.
Sandra, I think that's your hand up for a second time, I think. I feel like I saw that appear.
Yes, it is, but is there someone else?
Nope, there's nobody else in line, so you're up.
Okay, oops, we might go. Thank you. I really liked your answers to both Melanie and Philip's questions. And I like that expression, if it ought to be done, it should be done, right? I mean, there's just, and because there's a different kind of ought feel when you hear it out loud. If I read that, I might not get really, but listening to you say it, I got it. I was with you all the way. My question is going back to Melanie's question about distributive justice, because when I was at Queen's, I took Alistair MacLeod's class in distributive justice and kind of left Queen's thinking, wow, distributive justice can solve the world's problems. But I've kind of fallen back actually more in the notion of starting with human rights than with distributive justice. And I'm not talking about Rawls' rights either. I'm talking about the basic right to life, where it seems to me you are when you're talking about the needs of these workers. And somehow in Western society, we don't take the notion of need as a notion that is connected with justice. In my understanding of Indigenous ways of thinking, they do. I mean, they shared with us, they took care of us. And that notion is just, we pass over to the individual in Western society the responsibility to take care of their own needs. And if you've got the right structure in place, yeah, sure. But we don't have in Canada a living wage. I don't get rid of minimum unless what you mean by minimum is living, right? And I think that if that structure was in place in our country, you wouldn't have a paper to write. Really, as long as the people that came into the country were regarded as real people, you know? A comment, please.
Yeah, so I guess in a similar line of response to the one I had to Melanie is that I think so even if we had a living wage, like a true living wage that didn't require people to have to sacrifice different areas of their life in order to fund other areas of their life, like important areas of their life. I don't think that solves the full problem. I think so. For instance, like say there is a living wage that is afforded to migrant care workers when they come to Canada, but those care workers still Canada still has the sort of clause that when care workers cease their employment, they're immediately to be deported. I think that there remains sort of a level of vulnerability. So even if they have a living wage, there's still a level of vulnerability there such that employers can ask them to do things that they might not ask to do sort of landed Canadian citizens. And I think that is a problem that isn't, I mean, it's captured by distributive justice insofar as distributive justice sort of is the distribution not of goods, but also of rights. And so rights not to be exploited in those ways would serve to protect migrant care workers there. But I do think the idea of a living wage, while it is surely something that should exist and does solve a lot of problems, wouldn't sort of capture the full scope of vulnerability that I think certain migrant workers face.
All right, any other questions? Anybody else want to take the last question of the webinar? Not seeing any hands. So that was just really, that was interesting, of course. All these talks are so interesting. So join me in thanking Jordan for his fantastic paper.
Thanks, everybody.
So I'd like to thank both Casey and Jordan for presenting their papers today. Special thanks to Casey because it's the middle of the night. So thank you for tuning in. That's commitment to ethics. So thank you. Thank you, audience members, for attending this talk. Also like to thank Diane Lalonde, who's our VP of the CSSPE and the person who is behind the scenes making all of this possible and working all of the tech. And also like to thank Andrew Mullis and Karina Lee, who are the coordinators of the 2020 conference that didn't happen, and then sort of helped us put together the webinar series as a response to that. So just a reminder that we are now accepting abstracts, papers, and proposals for the 2021-2022 and webinar series, and those would be due September 1st. And then we will have webinars like this for people to attend every second month starting, I think the first one, it's on the website, but I think it's like the last Sunday in September, and then every second month after that. But again, you can check the website for details. It's important that we keep having these conversations because ethics is important, and we should keep talking about it, even when, you know, circumstances are kind of strange. And we do it over Zoom, but this is working pretty good. So we're going to keep doing this. So our website, which I think, yeah, Diane has put in the chat box there, is csspe.ca. And other than that, that's it for today. So thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend. Be ethical. And hopefully I'll see you at the next webinar.